In the waning days of his reign, Henry VIII, once the Golden Prince of England, lay in his bedchamber at Whitehall Palace, a grotesque shell of the man he had been. His body, swollen and festering with oozing sores, emitted a stench so vile that even his most loyal courtiers could barely stand to be near him. This was no ordinary illness, but a horrifying decay that seemed to rot the king alive, a physical manifestation of the turmoil and tyranny that had defined his rule. As whispers of his condition spread through the court in early 1547, the question hung heavy in the air. How had one of England's most powerful monarchs come to such a wretched end? This is the bizarre and tragic story of Henry VIII, a king whose insatiable appetites and iron will reshape the nation, only to be undone by the very body that once symbolized his might. To understand the depths of Henry's decline, we must first step back to the dawn of his reign, to a time when he was the embodiment of Renaissance ideals. Born on the 28th of June, 1491 at Greenwich Palace, Henry was the second son of Henry VII, the first Tudor king, and Elizabeth of York. His early life was not marked by the expectation of the throne. That burden fell to his elder brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales. Henry was raised in relative freedom, educated in theology, music, and languages, and trained in the chivalric arts of jousting and hunting. He grew into a striking figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with auburn hair and a commanding presence that captivated all who met him. When Arthur died unexpectedly in 1502 at the age of 15, Henry's destiny shifted overnight. At just 10 years old, he became the heir to the English throne, and with it, inherited the weight of his father's hard-won dynasty. Henry ascended to the throne on the 21st of April, 1509, at the age of 17, following his father's death. England rejoiced at the sight of this young, vigorous king, a stark contrast to the austere and calculating Henry VII. The new monarch was a vision of promise, marrying Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, in a union that symbolized both continuity and alliance with powerful Spain. Together, they were crowned in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey, heralding what many believed would be a golden age. Henry was not merely a king. He was a scholar, a musician, and an athlete, embodying the Renaissance ideal of a ruler who excelled in both mind and body. He composed music, wrote poetry, and dazzled at tournaments, earning admiration across Europe as a paragon of kingship. Yet beneath this polished exterior lay a restless ambition and a temper that would soon reveal itself in devastating ways. The early years of Henry's reign were marked by a kingdom eager for stability after decades of civil war. The Wars of the Roses had left deep scars on England, and the Tudor dynasty was still young, its legitimacy questioned by lingering Yorkist claimants. Henry VII had secured the throne through marriage and ruthless suppression of rivals, but it was up to his son to solidify the family's grip on power. Henry VIII inherited a realm at peace, with a full treasury thanks to his father's frugality, and a court eager to bask in the splendor of a new era. He surrounded himself with brilliant minds like Thomas Wolsey, a cleric who rose to become his chief minister, and forged alliances through diplomacy and displays of grandeur. But even in these early, hopeful days, there were hints of the volatility that would define his rule. Henry's obsession with producing a male heir, a necessity to secure the Tudor line, began to gnaw at him as Catherine suffered multiple miscarriages and stillbirths, with only one child, a daughter named Mary, surviving infancy. Beyond the personal, the political landscape of Europe was shifting in ways that would test Henry's mettle. The continent was a chessboard of rival powers: France under Francis I, the Holy Roman Empire under Charles V, and the ever-present influence of the Pope in Rome. Henry sought to position England as a major player, engaging in wars with France to reclaim lost territories and assert his martial prowess. These campaigns, while initially popular, drained the treasury and revealed the limits of his patience for failure. At home, the seeds of religious tension were already sown, as the Catholic Church's dominance faced growing criticism from reformers inspired by Martin Luther's ideas. Henry, a devout Catholic in his early years, even wrote a treatise defending the Pope against Luther, earning the title Defender of the Faith in 1521. Yet this loyalty would soon be tested by his personal desires and the political necessities of his reign. As the 1520s dawned, the cracks in Henry's idyllic image began to widen. His marriage to Catherine, once a symbol of unity, became a source of frustration as the lack of a male heir fueled his insecurity. He grew increasingly distant from her, his eye wandering to younger, more vivacious women at court. The king, who had once been celebrated for his virtue and vigor, was beginning to show signs of the impulsiveness and cruelty that would later define him. Meanwhile, his body, still strong and athletic, bore no hint of the grotesque decay that awaited him in his final years. But the choices he made in these early decades, driven by pride, lust, and an unyielding need for control, would set the stage for both his greatest triumphs and his most horrifying downfall. The story of Henry VIII is not just one of a king, but of a man whose appetites consumed everything in their path, including himself. As the 1520s progressed, the once golden reign of Henry VIII began to darken under the weight of personal obsession and political upheaval. The king's desperate need for a male heir, a linchpin for the Tudor dynasty's survival, morphed into a consuming fixation that would tear apart his marriage, his court, and eventually the very fabric of England's religious identity. At the heart of this brewing storm was Catherine of Aragon, the steadfast Spanish queen who had endured years of heartbreak through miscarriages and the loss of infant sons. By now, in her late 30s, her ability to bear more children was dwindling, and Henry's frustration with her grew into a cold, calculated resolve. He began to question not just her fertility, but the very legitimacy of their union, citing a biblical passage from Leviticus that warned against marrying a brother's widow, a convenient justification for a man whose heart had already turned elsewhere. Enter Anne Boleyn, a young woman of sharp wit and striking allure who had returned to the English court after years in the sophisticated courts of the Netherlands and France. Unlike the pious and reserved Catherine, Anne was bold, ambitious, and unafraid to challenge the king with her intellect. Henry first noticed her around 1526, and what began as a passing fancy soon spiraled into an all-consuming passion. But Anne was no mere mistress. She refused to be cast aside as a temporary dalliance, demanding marriage and the crown before she would yield to Henry's desires. This audacious stance only fueled his obsession, turning a personal infatuation into a political crisis of unprecedented scale. To marry Anne, Henry needed to annul his marriage to Catherine, a process that required the approval of Pope Clement VII, a man caught between the spiritual authority of the Church and the political pressures of Catherine's powerful nephew, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The stage was set for a conflict that would shake England to its core. Henry, with the aid of his cunning chief minister Thomas Wolsey, petitioned Rome for an annulment, arguing that his marriage to Catherine had been cursed by God, as evidenced by the lack of a surviving male heir. But the Pope, wary of offending Charles V, whose troops had recently sacked Rome in 1527, delayed and deflected. Months turned into years, and Henry's patient Senever, his strongest virtue, wore thin. Wolsey, once the king's most trusted advisor, bore the brunt of this failure, falling from grace as Henry's anger sought a scapegoat. By 1529, Wolsey was stripped of his power, accused of treason, and would die the following year before facing trial. His downfall marked a turning point. Henry was no longer content to rely on others to solve his problems. He would take matters into his own hands, even if it meant defying the most powerful institution in Christendom. Meanwhile, Anne Boleyn's influence over Henry grew, her presence at court a constant reminder of what he could not yet have. She was a polarizing figure, admired by some for her intelligence and reformist leanings, despised by others as a scheming temptress who threatened the queen's rightful place. Catherine, for her part, remained resolute, refusing to accept the annulment and appealing directly to the Pope for justice. Her dignity in the face of humiliation won her sympathy among the English people, many of whom saw her as a wronged woman and a true queen. This public sentiment only deepened the divide at court, where factions began to form, those loyal to Catherine and the old Catholic order, and those aligning with Anne and the whispers of religious reform that were sweeping through Europe. Henry found himself at the center of a maelstrom, torn between his personal desires and the political realities of a kingdom on the brink of fracture. Beyond the domestic turmoil, Henry's foreign policy ambitions added fuel to the fire. His early wars with France, once a source of national pride, had become costly and inconclusive, straining the royal coffers and eroding public support. The alliance with Spain, cemented by his marriage to Catherine, was now a liability as Charles V's opposition to the annulment hardened. Henry's dream of being a great European power was slipping through his fingers, overshadowed by the personal scandal that consumed his court. At home, the ideas of the Protestant Reformation were gaining traction, fueled by discontent with the Catholic Church's wealth and corruption. While Henry remained outwardly loyal to Rome, his need for the annulment pushed him into the orbit of reformist thinkers like Thomas Cranmer, a cleric who would later become a key architect of England's break with the Pope. The king's personal crisis was becoming a national one, as religious, political, and dynastic tensions intertwined in a dangerous dance. By the early 1530s, the conflict had reached a boiling point. Henry, driven by his obsession with Anne and his unyielding need for a son, was no longer willing to wait for Rome's approval. His once robust frame was beginning to show signs of wear from years of excess, and injuria jousting accident in 1524 had left him with recurring headaches, and another in 1536 would cause a severe leg wound that never fully healed. These physical ailments, though minor at the time, hinted at the vulnerabilities of a man who had once seemed invincible. Yet his will remained ironclad, and his determination to reshape his destiny and England's would lead to decisions that reverberated through history. The king, who had once been hailed as a defender of the faith, was on the verge of becoming its greatest adversary, setting the stage for a dramatic and irreversible rupture. By 1533, Henry VIII had reached a point of no return. His obsession with Anne Boleyn and his desperate need for a male heir had driven him to defy the Pope, shattering centuries of religious tradition in England. In a bold and unprecedented move, he declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, severing ties with Rome through the Act of Supremacy. This seismic shift, orchestrated with the help of reformist allies like Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell, allowed Henry to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon without papal consent. Catherine, stripped of her title as Queen and relegated to the status of Dowager Princess of Wales, was effectively imprisoned in a series of remote residences, separated from her beloved daughter Mary, and forbidden from public life. Her spirit, though unbroken, was worn down by isolation and the betrayal of a husband she had once loved. Henry's heart, however, was elsewhere. Anne Boleyn was crowned queen in a lavish ceremony, and by September of that year, she gave birth to a child. But the child was not the son Henry had risked everything for. It was a daughter, Elizabeth, and the disappointment hung heavy over the court. Anne's position, though elevated, was precarious from the start. The English people, many of whom still revered Catherine, viewed her with suspicion and resentment, whispering of her as a usurper who had bewitched the king. Her failure to produce a male heir in the years that followed only deepened the cracks in her relationship with Henry. Miscarriages and stillbirths plagued her, mirroring Catherine's tragic history, and Henry's once passionate love began to curdle into frustration. By 1536, the king's eye had wandered again, this time to Jane Seymour, a quiet and demure lady-in-waiting, whose meekness stood in stark contrast to Anne's fiery independence. Anne's enemies at court, sensing her vulnerability, began to close in, and Henry, ever impatient for a solution to his dynastic woes, allowed himself to be swayed by accusations of infidelity and treason against her. In May 1536, Anne was arrested, imprisoned in the Tower of London, and subjected to a sham trial. The charges adultery, incest with her brother, and plotting against the king were almost certainly fabricated, but they served their purpose. On May 19, she was beheaded, her fall from grace as swift and brutal as her rise had been dazzling. Henry, showing no remorse, married Jane Seymour just 11 days later, a chilling testament to his growing ruthlessness. While Henry's personal life descended into a cycle of marriage and betrayal, his physical condition began to mirror the decay of his moral compass. The jousting accident of 1536, which had nearly killed him, left a severe wound on his leg that refused to heal. The ulcerated sore festered, causing chronic pain and emitting a foul odor that even the finest physicians of the realm could not remedy. This injury marked the beginning of a steep decline in the king's once robust health. His weight ballooned as his mobility decreased, the result of a voracious appetite for rich foods and wine combined with an inability to exercise as he once had. The athletic prince who had once dazzled at tournaments was becoming a bloated, irritable tyrant, prone to violent mood swings that terrified those around him. Courtiers whispered of his temper, which could turn deadly on a whim, and the atmosphere at court grew suffocating under the weight of his paranoia. The man who had once embodied Renaissance vigor was now a prisoner of his own failing body, his physical decline a cruel parallel to the imprisonment of those who had once been closest to him. Catherine of Aragon, meanwhile, had died in January 1536, likely of a broken heart as much as any physical ailment, while confined at Kimbolton Castle. Her death, though a relief to Henry in some ways, did little to ease the tensions in his realm. Her daughter Mary, declared illegitimate after the annulment, lived under constant threat, her Catholic faith and loyalty to her mother's memory making her a potential rallying point for dissenters. Henry's break with Rome had unleashed a wave of unrest, as monasteries were dissolved and their wealth seized under Thomas Cromwell's direction. The Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive rebellion in the north of England in 1536, was a direct response to these religious reforms, with tens of thousands of commoners and nobles alike demanding a return to the old faith. Henry, ever cunning, promised concessions to quell the uprising, only to renege on his word and execute its leaders once the threat had passed. His duplicity cemented his reputation as a ruler who would stop at nothing to maintain control, even as his policies alienated swathes of his subjects. Jane Seymour, the new queen, offered a brief glimmer of hope amidst this turmoil. In October 1537, she gave birth to the long-awaited male heir, Edward, a triumph that seemed to vindicate Henry's relentless pursuit of a son. But the joy was short-lived. Jane died just 12 days later from childbirth complications, plunging Henry into a rare moment of genuine grief. Though he would marry 3 more times, Anne of Cleves in a brief and unconsummated union, Catherine Howard, who met a tragic end like Anne Boleyn, and finally Catherine Parr, who outlived him none, would replicate the fleeting stability Jane had brought. With each marriage, Henry's paranoia deepened, his court becoming a nest of intrigue where loyalty was a currency few could afford to spend. His leg wound worsened, infections setting in and spreading, while his weight continued to climb, rendering him nearly immobile by his early 50s. The king, who had once ruled with charisma and strength, was now a shadow of himself, trapped in a body that betrayed him as surely as he had betrayed so many others. The rot, both literal and figurative, was setting in, and the worst was yet to come. By the early 1540s, Henry VIII's reign had become a grim shadow of its once glorious beginnings. The king, now in his 50s, was a man tormented by both the betrayals he perceived around him and the unrelenting decay of his own body. The chronic wound on his leg, a lingering consequence of the 1536 jousting accident, had grown into a suppurating nightmare, oozing pus and emitting a stench so overpowering that even the most stoic courtiers struggled to mask their revulsion. Physicians, desperate to ease his pain, applied poultices and drained the wound, but their efforts often worsened the infection, leaving Henry in constant agony. His mobility, once a hallmark of his athletic youth, was all but gone. He relied on a wheeled chair to move through the vast halls of his palaces, a humiliating necessity for a man who had once prided himself on physical prowess. His weight, ballooning to over 300 pounds due to unchecked gluttony and immobility, strained his frame, exacerbating the pain in his joints and making every movement a torturous ordeal. This physical suffering was matched by a mental anguish that gnawed at Henry's once sharp mind. Paranoia had taken root, fueled by years of political intrigue and personal betrayals both real and imagined. The executions of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, the latter beheaded in 1542 for adultery and treason, had left him wary of even those closest to him. Catherine Howard's betrayal, or at least the perception of it, cut deep. She had been a young, vivacious bride who briefly rekindled Henry's sense of vitality, only to shatter it with whispers of infidelity. Her death, ordered by a king too broken to show mercy, was a stark reminder of how far he had fallen from the chivalrous prince of his youth. Every whisper at court became a potential threat, every advisor a possible traitor. Thomas Cromwell, the brilliant architect of the break with Rome, had been executed in 1540 on flimsy charges of heresy and treason, a victim of Henry's shifting moods and the machinations of rival factions. The king's trust, once freely given, was now a rare commodity, replaced by a suffocating suspicion that poisoned every interaction. Henry's court, once a center of Renaissance splendor, had transformed into a den of fear. Nobles and servants alike tiptoed around the king's volatile temper, knowing that a single misstep could lead to disgrace or death. His outbursts, often triggered by the smallest perceived slight, were legendary roars of rage that echoed through palace corridors, followed by swift and brutal punishments. Even his children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, lived under the shadow of his wrath. Mary, still clinging to her Catholic faith, was a constant source of irritation to her father, who saw her devotion as a challenge to his authority over the Church of England. Elizabeth, though young, bore the stigma of her mother Anne's disgrace, while Edward, the precious heir, was kept at a distance, overprotected to the point of isolation. Henry's sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, married to him in 1543, navigated this treacherous landscape with remarkable skill. A twice-widowed woman of intellect and compassion, she managed to soothe his temper and even influenced a temporary reconciliation with his daughters. Yet even she was not immune to danger. A near arrest for heresy in 1546, narrowly averted by her quick thinking and submission, underscored the ever-present peril of life at Henry's side. Beyond the personal, Henry's policies continued to inflict suffering on a national scale. The dissolution of the monasteries, completed by the early 1540s, had uprooted centuries of religious and social tradition, leaving thousands of monks and nuns destitute and destroying irreplaceable cultural heritage. The wealth seized from these institutions filled the royal coffers but did little to ease the discontent among the common people, many of whom mourned the loss of spiritual and communal centers. Henry's religious reforms, oscillating between Catholic traditions and Protestant innovations, created confusion and division, alienating both staunch Catholics and fervent reformers. His wars, too, drained the kingdom's resources. Campaigns against Scotland and France in the 1540s, driven by a fading desire for military glory, brought little gain and immense cost. The Battle of Solway Moss in 1542 humiliated the Scots, but the subsequent invasion of France, culminating in the capture of Boulogne in 1544, was a Pyrrhic victory, achieved at a staggering financial and human toll. England groaned under heavy taxation and inflation, while Henry, oblivious to the suffering of his subjects, retreated further into his own pain and delusions of grandeur. The king's physical torment reached new heights as infections spread from his leg wound, likely compounded by undiagnosed conditions such as diabetes or gout, which modern historians speculate may have contributed to his rapid deterioration. His skin, once fair and robust, was marred by boils and abscesses, and his fevers came and went with alarming frequency. Sleep eluded him, his nights filled with pain and restless paranoia, while his days were spent in a haze of opiates prescribed by desperate doctors. The stench of his decaying flesh became a grim metaphor for a reign rotting from within, a kingdom held together only by the iron will of a man who could no longer stand unaided. Those who attended him, physicians, servants, and even Catherine, parted so with a mix of pity and dread, witnessing a king whose body had become his prison, a torture chamber from which there was no escape. As 1546 drew to a close, it was clear to all that Henry's time was running out, though none dared speak it aloud. The once mighty monarch, who had reshaped England in his image, was now a broken man, his suffering a prelude to a final, inevitable reckoning. As the winter of 1546 settled over England, a palpable tension gripped the royal court at Whitehall Palace. Henry VIII, now 55 years old, lay in his vast bedchamber, a grotesque figure barely recognizable as the vibrant king of decades past. His body, ravaged by years of excess and injury, had become a battlefield of decay. The festering wound on his leg, now a gaping ulcer, seeped with infection, while his immense frame, swollen to an almost unimaginable size, labored under the strain of every shallow breath. The air around him was thick with the rancid odor of rotting flesh, a stench so overpowering that even the most devoted attendants struggled to linger in his presence. Physicians hovered helplessly, their remedies exhausted, as the king drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind clouded by pain and the heavy doses of opiates meant to dull it. The end was near, and everyone knew it, though none dared voice the inevitable. This was the climactic unraveling of a monarch who had once bent a nation to his will, now reduced to a pitiful shell, rotting alive in the very heart of his kingdom. Henry's final weeks were a harrowing descent into both physical torment and existential dread. Fever racked his body, drenching him in sweat one moment and leaving him shivering the next. His skin, mottled with sores and abscesses, bore the marks of a man whose very flesh seemed to rebel against him. He could no longer move without assistance, his once powerful limbs rendered useless by pain and atrophy. When awake, his eyes sunset sharp with cunning and authority darted with paranoia, searching the faces of those around him for signs of betrayal. He muttered incoherently at times, haunted by the ghosts of those he had condemned: Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Thomas Cromwell, and countless others whose blood stained his legacy. Catherine Parr, his steadfast final wife, remained by his side, her presence a rare comfort in these dark hours, though even she could not shield him from the reality of his condition. The court, sensing the impending void, buzzed with whispered plots and alliances, as factions vied for influence over the young Prince Edward, the frail 9-year-old heir who would soon inherit a fractured realm. By late January 1547, Henry's condition had deteriorated beyond hope. On the 27th of January, he summoned his closest advisors, including Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, to his bedside. In a voice weakened by pain but still carrying the weight of royal command, he dictated his final will, ensuring the succession of Edward and naming a council of regents to govern during the boy's minority. The act was a final assertion of control, a desperate attempt to secure the Tudor dynasty he had fought so ruthlessly to preserve. Yet even in these last moments, Henry's fear of death loomed large. Raised in the Catholic faith despite his break with Rome, he grappled with the uncertainty of his soul's fate, reportedly weeping as Cranmer offered spiritual solace. The king who had defied a pope and reshaped a church now faced the ultimate judgment, his bravado crumbling under the weight of mortality. As the hours ticked by, his breathing grew more labored, each gasp a struggle against the inevitable. Finally, in the early hours of the 28th of January, 1547, Henry VIII took his last breath. His massive body still at last, the torment of his final years mercifully ended. The moment of his death was both a release and a shockwave. Attendants, hardened by months of witnessing his decline, stood in stunned silence as the reality sank in the indomitable Henry. The tyrant who had ruled with an iron fist was gone. His body, too decayed for immediate public display, was hastily prepared for burial, the stench necessitating a swift enclosure in a lead-lined coffin. Word spread through the court and beyond, carrying with it a mix of relief, fear, and uncertainty. For many, Henry's death marked the end of an era of terror. For others, it heralded a dangerous unknown, as the young Edward VI, a sickly child under the sway of ambitious nobles, ascended to the throne. The king's passing was not mourned with the universal grief one might expect of a long-reigning monarch. Instead, it was met with a quiet dread what would become of England now, without the larger-than-life figure who had dominated it for nearly 4 decades. The gruesome nature of Henry's demise became the stuff of whispered legend even before his coffin was laid to rest. Stories circulated of a body so corrupted by disease that it leaked fluids during transport to Windsor, a macabre detail that seemed to symbolize the rot at the heart of his reign. On the 16th of February, 1547, he was interred in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, beside Jane Seymour, the only wife to have given him the son he so craved. The ceremony, though grand, could not mask the undercurrent of unease that permeated the kingdom. Henry's death was not just the end of a man, but the culmination of a reign defined by excess, cruelty, and transformation, a reign that had reshaped England at a terrible cost. As the heavy stone closed over his tomb, it sealed not just his mortal remains, but the memory of a king whose final years had been a living nightmare, a cautionary tale of power unchecked and a body betrayed by its own appetites. The death of Henry VIII on the 28th of January, 1547, left England in a state of uneasy transition. The once towering monarch, whose will had shaped the destiny of a nation, was gone, and in his place stood a fragile 9-year-old boy, Edward VI, now king under the guidance of a council of regents. The immediate aftermath was marked by a scramble for power among the nobility, with Edward's uncle, Edward Seymour, quickly asserting himself as Lord Protector. The young king, sickly and sheltered, was a stark contrast to his father's domineering presence, and the court buzzed with uncertainty about the future of the Tudor dynasty. Henry's religious reforms, which had torn England from Rome and established the Church of England, became a battleground almost instantly. Edward's reign, influenced by Protestant advisors, pushed further toward Reformation, dismantling much of the Catholic imagery and ritual that Henry had paradoxically clung to despite his break with the Pope. This shift alienated many, including Henry's eldest daughter Mary, whose staunch Catholicism positioned her as a potential threat and a symbol of resistance. Henry's other children, Elizabeth and Mary, navigated a precarious landscape in the wake of his death. Mary, declared illegitimate during Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn, remained a figure of contention, her claim to the throne a lingering question mark. Elizabeth, just 13 at the time of her father's passing, was equally marginalized, her mother's tragic fate casting a long shadow over her early life. Yet both daughters would eventually ascend to the throne, each leaving an indelible mark on English history. Mary, with her brief, bloody attempt to restore Catholicism, and Elizabeth with a golden age of stability and cultural flourishing. Their reigns, though shaped by their father's tumultuous legacy, also reflected a resilience born of surviving his court's dangers. The personal toll of Henry's reign on his family was immense. His relentless pursuit of a male heir had fractured relationships and sown seeds of distrust that echoed through generations. Edward VI, the long-sought son, ruled for only 6 years before succumbing to illness in 1553, his death plunging England into further chaos as Mary seized the crown. On a broader scale, Henry's policies left lasting scars and transformations across the kingdom. The dissolution of the monasteries, completed in his lifetime, had reshaped the social and economic fabric of England, redirecting vast wealth to the crown, but leaving rural communities bereft of spiritual and charitable support. The break with Rome, while initially driven by personal desire, set the stage for centuries of religious conflict, as England oscillated between Protestantism and Catholicism under his successors. His wars, particularly the costly campaigns in France and Scotland, had depleted the treasury, leaving a financial burden that Edward's regents struggled to manage. Yet for all the destruction, Henry's reign also laid the groundwork for England's emergence as a naval power and a centralized state. His investment in the Navy, spurred by rivalry with European powers, would prove crucial in later conflicts, while his assertion of royal supremacy over the Church fundamentally altered the relationship between crown and clergy. The England he left behind was irrevocably changed, stronger in some ways, but deeply divided in others. Henry's legacy, however, is as much about the man as it is about his policies. To history, he remains a paradox, a Renaissance prince turned tyrant, a defender of faith who defied a pope, a king whose personal appetites reshaped a nation. His 6 marriages, each a chapter of drama and tragedy, have cemented his image as a larger-than-life figure, often caricatured as the gluttonous, wife-discarding monarch of popular imagination. Yet beneath the myths lies a more complex truth. Henry was a man of immense charisma and intellect, capable of profound cruelty and profound vision, whose flaws were magnified by the unchecked power he wielded. His physical decline, the horrifying rot that consumed him in his final years, became a metaphor for a reign that began with promise and ended in decay. Chroniclers of the time, and historians since, have grappled with how to remember him, some as a monster, others as a necessary force of change. In the centuries that followed, his story was both celebrated and condemned, a cautionary tale of ambition and excess that refuses to fade from memory. As we reflect on the bizarre and tragic case of Henry VIII, one question lingers: what does it mean to wield power when it comes at the cost of one's humanity? His life, marked by brilliance and brutality, forces us to confront the thin line between greatness and ruin, between the desire to build a legacy and the destruction left in its wake. The king who rotted alive was not just a victim of his body's betrayal, but of a deeper, rotten, insatiable hunger for control that consumed everything in its path, including himself. His story is a haunting reminder that even the mightiest can fall, their triumphs overshadowed by the weight of their own flaws. If this tale has stirred something in you, whether curiosity, horror, or wonder, share your thoughts. What do you make of Henry VIII's legacy? Was he a visionary who reshaped England, or a tyrant whose personal demons tore it apart? Let's keep this conversation alive, diving deeper into the shadows of history together.